So the Rental Protection Fund, as you heard in the introduction, was established last year in March of 2023 with a $500 million investment from the province of BC. Now, that investment is held in an independent, arm's-length nonprofit entity that's governed by the community housing sector. So it includes Tom Armstrong, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with, of CHFBC, Jill Atkey of BC Nonprofit Housing Association, and Margaret Foe of the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, who together form the board of our organization and govern the Rental Protection Fund. And my staff and I work hard every day to get as many homes protected as we can in collaboration with all sorts of members of the community housing sector here in BC. It's really built on the notion that the most affordable housing we have is actually the housing that we've already got. You cannot build it new for anywhere near this cost, let alone subsidize rents to meet these ones where they're at. And that if acquired with the right amount of equity, those rents can remain affordable in perpetuity without the need for ongoing subsidy. And retaining those while we can. Because what was happening, and this is happening across the country, and it's just a matter of how fast or how many units for each new one being built, but we were losing 4 to 5 units for every new unit that was being built. And at that rate, no matter how many new legislative changes we make here in BC to bring on new supply, we can't keep up. I think it's Tom who likes to say, you can roll out the carpet in front of you, but if it's rolling up behind you faster than you can, you're just getting tangled in that rug. And that's exactly what was happening and why the community housing sector here advocated for the Rental Protection Fund. And it does exist to preserve not only these homes, commonly referred to as naturally occurring affordable housing, but the affordability themselves, and in the case of co-ops in particular, preserving that co-op tenure, not just those homes and those renters. And it does so through a one-time capital contribution as well as a renewal grant. And with that capital contribution, it bridges the equity gap that inherently exists between the value of the property and what the rents can support in terms of a loan. There's always going to be a gap no matter who is buying it. It doesn't matter whether it's a nonprofit, a co-op, or the private sector. Everyone has that equity gap, and it can either be overcome with access to funding like this, or it is typically overcome by buying it anyways and raising the rents to help it get there. What it also does, though, and is the really powerful long-term impact, is that because these rents can remain affordable without the need for ongoing operating subsidy, these assets are also inherently more leverageable. They carry real weight on the balance sheet in a way a lot of you guys are all familiar with, probably more than anyone, right? Community assets build community wealth, and I feel like the land trust model innovated that first and foremost, and this is just a spin and expansion on that in many ways. The more assets that we can move into the community housing sector that are wholly owned by the community housing sector, the better. And that we can retain and renew what we already have. Yes, some buildings are very old and past their useful life, but a lot of them, if caught now, can have enough investment to keep them around for decades longer to come. And that is very much worth doing when the cost of building new is so high. What it also does is deal with the fact that it's far more cost-effective to maintain the affordability that already exists, much like the housing that already exists, than it is to achieve it once it's been lost. The units we've acquired so far since launching last year are on average about 48% below market rates. 48% below market rates without an ounce of subsidy now or going forward. And even though the groups acquiring through the fund can still increase rents according to our Residential Tenancy Act standards or any other standards that we've co-created with them, that marginal growth in rent over time just is stable and pales in comparison to how quickly the market rent is going to continue to increase. And so what starts as a 48% below market gap on rents quickly grows, and in 20 years we could see that these rents in these buildings are 75-80% below market without an ounce of subsidy either. So I touched on this a little bit already, but we are inherently governed by the community housing sector, which I think was also a really powerful choice on the part of the province to make this arm's length, independent, and not a crown corporation or government agency. And that's really necessary in a lot of ways to be able to move nimbly enough for acquisitions. Yes, we're in a slower market right now, but this still moves a lot faster than a lot of other programs are capable, or acquisitions move a lot faster than a lot of other programs are capable of moving. And also fundamentally what it did is no one knows this better than those who are boots on the ground, right? The nonprofits, cooperatives who are doing this work day in and day out, and that collectively we'd all be positioned to deliver this most efficiently and effectively. Recognizing, though, that our board is comprised of 3 membership organizations, of which their members would be applying to the fund, we do also have an independent investment advisory board who's comprised of a variety of real estate, finance experts from across the industry, as well as a representative from the province of BC, who review every single application that comes through the Rental Protection Fund, makes recommendations on whether to approve it, and also conditions they might advise form part of the ultimate agreement. And what they do is evaluate it on this set of funding priorities that really are focused on ensuring the broadest geographic distribution of the fund, the greatest leverage of the fund possible, attracting additional capital to the table. The CLT here in BC, who you're all familiar with, and I think heard from Tiffany earlier today, they still hold the prize as having, I think, attracted the greatest amount of equity to the table in there so far, bringing, I believe, $5.6 million from the City of Coquitlam to support the acquisition of 290 cooperative housing units in Coquitlam, which was our very first announcement through the Rental Protection Fund. What's also trying to make sure that we're doing too is that all of these organizations are really set up for long-term success, long-term affordability. We'd far rather make sure they're asking for the right amount now to sustain them for decades to come than have anyone end up in a position where that's not going to be the case. It's also very applicant-led, so everyone who acquires through the fund comes forward first to pre-qualify as an applicant. And you only have to do that once, because we knew that it was going to be critical for all of these organizations, once they found a site, to be able to move forward quickly and efficiently. And so by pre-qualifying them, we're able to make sure they've got that out of the way. They don't need to do it again every time. They're still the same organization, and they can bring back multiple properties to acquire should they so choose once they have been pre-qualified. And that's really just getting a sense of their capacity, their growth intentions, the acquisition strategy, which really helps us understand what they're looking for. It also helps brokers and vendors who may have good properties for them understand what they're looking for in their acquisition. And then subsequently come through stage 2 and 3, which make sure the property fits our criteria, and then everyone goes off and conducts their due diligence. Right now, every nonprofit who acquires through the fund does need to secure their own mortgage for the property, but one of the things we are very excited about with the Canada Rental Protection Fund, which will hopefully get flowing as soon as possible here, is that is going to make it a whole lot easier for folks to secure debt much more efficiently and frankly much more equitably. It's really challenging in some cases for those groups who are either acquiring in more rural communities or maybe based in more rural communities, or who are acquiring smaller buildings to sometimes access or already have the kind of banking relationships that help them secure those mortgages. And that shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be that just because you're small or in a rural community that it makes you are less able to benefit from this investment. And I do think that having that debt be universally available across the country, but really anywhere, is going to be a real game changer in that regard. We've been fortunate that we've worked really hard with a lot of the nonprofits and banking partners to make sure that no deals fell through because of that. But it also, again, should not be that hard. So we're really, really looking forward to that being the case. And hopefully then, whether it's us or us and versions of us in every other province, can kind of be that one-stop shop for the funding, for the debt, and for even retrofit financing, which we provide currently a renewal grant to supplement that, but really to kind of roll it all into one quite nicely. One of the things we've also been doing is really coming at this from a data-driven perspective for a few reasons. One, we knew that there's just going to be an immense amount of information and a lot of decisions we were going to have to make, and committing to that data-driven approach from the beginning was really, really critical. But also, we were trying to create tools that make, let's say, the matchmaking of this whole process easier, and also give the sector sovereignty back over its own data, and using that to help negotiate their acquisitions and other things like that. So one of the first ones is our property submission portal, and this lives on our website where anyone, brokers, vendors, even tenants sometimes, can submit properties here if they are interested in seeing them acquired through the fund. And then this is actually available to the nonprofits on the back end who have been pre-qualified, so that they can actually go through here and see if any of these are of interest to them. Because we can't do the direct matchmaking ourselves. I like to refer to it as we can't match everybody up, but we can do a lot of things like this to make sure that everybody is showing up to speed dating with a little bit of information about each other and hoping that good matches happen along the way. So this is certainly one of those. One of the other pieces we're rolling out, just see if I can get the video to play. But one of the things we're rolling out shortly as well is a platform we're calling SHARP, our Strategic Housing Acquisition Resource Platform. And this includes an immense amount of information on where existing publicly owned sites are, both municipal, provincial, and federal, and as well as existing nonprofit sites. We also, you'll see on the next slide, have transaction and valuation data as well that will be accessible. And part of the goal here is to equip the sector with access to this information so that they can make the most strategic acquisition possible. For example, having an acquisition where, without needing to displace anyone, they may be able to intensify and densify either on that site because it's got excess land, or we have one in city of Burnaby, actually. It's a great example where they've acquired 2 properties that are immediately adjacent to city-owned land. They're already talking with the city about partnering on that land next door. They'll be able to build a bunch more units, move those folks into brand new homes, and ultimately they will actually redevelop the property they bought through us, but they'll do so without displacing anyone. And that's a really well-leveraged long-term approach to the investment we're making and the impact to affordability overall. So this helps them tap into opportunities like that, as well as information on transactions, appraisals, different valuations, so that when the broker tries to tell them it's $3 million more than they think it is, they've got as much information as possible to back it up. And we're even filling this in with information as we receive it ourselves. We'll also be rolling out shortly a tenant protection policy atlas. So there's an immense amount of tenant protection policies all over the province, but they are wildly disaggregated. You're digging through 10 pages of different municipal websites just to find one, and making this universally available in a way that anyone, including the public, which is will ultimately roll out to, can understand what they are entitled to or what they might owe to the tenants in the case of a developer if they are at risk of displacement. So we're looking forward to rolling a couple of those out soon. But what it's also been doing for us in the meantime is really having a live dashboard of everything we've acquired to date and all the information that continues to underpin our decision making. Understanding where all of these properties kind of exist, not only in the context of the market, but the context of each other. In their building condition, for example, their depth of affordability below market, or even assessing kind of where they are in terms of strong community amenities, so distance to parks, distance to schools, and things like that. So these live live. Our team, our investment committee uses them all the time, and they're available as well to our board and to the province of BC, so that they have live, up-to-date information on where our progress is at. We've been at this technically since March of last year, but really didn't kick things off formally, I guess, until applications opened for pre-qualification on Canada Day of 2023. And by September of that year, we were pre-qualifying our first few dozen nonprofits. And by December, we were holding our first investment committee meeting. So since January, when things started to kind of actually close, we've acquired, or helped facilitate the acquisition rather, of officially now over 1,500 units. We were painfully shy of that total until just last week. So now we're officially over 1,500 units that have moved into the community housing sector since the launch of the fund. This also equates to about now $500 million of asset value that has moved into community housing sector ownership as well, across about 35 different properties of all scales and sizes too, which has been really key, and geographic dispersion, of course. See if this will play. But this is one of our acquisitions in Langley, and just to give you a sense of.
My name is Sonia.
Is there sound on here?
And I've lived in this building for 12 years.
Oh yeah.
Living here is great because it's close to my grocery store, my doctor's office, being able to walk to places that I don't have to rely on HandyDart. It's just awesome here. When I first found out the building was up for sale, panic mode set in, that all of the buildings around us, people are getting evicted or they have to go and find another apartment because the building's coming down. So of course, you're in a position where you're older, you don't have enough money. You may have enough money to rent, but you don't have enough money to continue on with your life. We went through the 6 months and no one could say what was happening to us. We just knew the building was up for sale and then it was sold. And I had a knock on my door at 6:30 that night, and there was all the information that New Vista had purchased the building, and I thought, now we're going to be okay.
Once the Rental Protection Fund was announced by the provincial government, we went into action mode and we started looking for apartment buildings to potentially purchase. We began working with commercial brokers and quickly identified these 2 buildings as a great opportunity. And honestly, this wouldn't be possible without the Rental Protection Fund. These buildings now are going to be protected with affordable rents for, seniors, families, persons with disabilities for decades, rather than torn down. The demand for seniors housing has only got more acute in the last 5 or 10 years. What we've seen is just a huge amount of seniors that are in dire need for affordable housing. We've got people that have lived on their own that don't have a family close by. We've seen rents in the Lower Mainland double. We've seen the cost of food go up by about 20, sometimes 30%. Everything's more expensive. So very quickly, almost like that, the Rental Protection Fund with its investments in the nonprofit sector has helped preserve somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 units of affordable rental housing for decades to come. And we're glad that with the assistance of the Rental Protection Fund that New Vista is able to be part of the solution in these 2 buildings.
If New Vista didn't buy this building, I would imagine I would be on the street with the other seniors that I see. I hear so many stories of people not knowing where they're going to live, and it's hard to put into words the change from a company that was for profit to a company that wants to take care of you.
So, and that's really who it's about at the end of the day as well. These are all of the folks who are kind of left behind by every other piece of the system right now. A lot of the people living in these buildings actually make just a little bit too much to qualify for subsidized housing through BC Housing or elsewhere, but are a long, long way away from being able to afford market rent. And in the case of a lot of the seniors in many of these buildings, for them that could be the difference, not just for them actually, between here and homelessness. What it also is though is the notion that previously housing security was something only reserved for those who owned their home and was not something guaranteed or available to renters, much like, I would argue, the ability to leverage assets in this way was not as widely something made available to the community housing sector as it should be, and that both of those things will really meaningfully start to change over time. This property actually was also one that was acquired from a REIT, and in this case, actually, the nonprofit was up against 2 other private sector bids. They were the lowest of the 3 bids, but the REIT actually chose their offer anyways because they really wanted to see these tenants be able to stay in their homes, and they knew that that nonprofit, with our support, was going to be able to ensure that that was the case. Did touch on this earlier, but we do have about 30 nonprofits who have now pre-qualified through the fund, and just over 130 total who have actually started applications or pre-qualified through the fund, which frankly is beyond any expectations we had in terms of the demand we would see when the fund was launched. And a lot of this is also the reason that we have been able to secure 1,500 units so far already. That is beyond what anyone, including me or the board, ever thought was going to be the case. But the community housing sector really, really rose to the challenge and continues to do so, which is why we are working to find ways to ensure we are around for as long as possible. But also, I would love to see that federal fund stood up, not only for the impact it'll have here, but to see this really, this model scale across the country, because it has a transformative effect on the growth of the community housing sector. This is also a question we get a lot, understandably, because everyone and their mother has a different definition of affordability or affordable housing and what that means. And for us, we look at it through a lens of secured affordability. So regardless of what everybody else's definitions are, it's the difference between if these people were to be evicted tomorrow, what are they facing out there in the private market in terms of rents, and what does that gap look like? Just how far away from market rents are they, and that depth of affordability that we're able to secure. And this just illustrates it a little bit in terms of both market rent and CMHC average primary market rents and their affordability data. This is also the really, really powerful thing that has happened as a result of the hard work of so many nonprofits who have acquired through the fund, and a lot of work from my team as well, is for the whole last decade, community housing sector, whether nonprofits or land trusts or co-ops, comprised barely 2% of all multifamily transactions in a given year. This year, so far in Q1 and 2 of 2024, the community housing sector here in BC has comprised 53% of all multifamily transactions. So that makes the community housing sector the single largest buyer of multifamily buildings in BC, which is a dramatic shift and a really, really powerful transformation. What we've also been able to do as we've acquired those units is attract significant private capital also to play a role in this. There's a great depth of untapped desire to be investing in affordable housing, but lacking kind of an existing vehicle to do so, which we're in the process of standing up. But we've already been able to facilitate over $200 million in private capital flowing into our acquisitions. Including some of that being impact investments. And in a lot of cases, this has actually been essential to ensuring that a number of these acquisitions did not fall apart completely due to delays getting financing through MLI Select or other things. A lot of those impact investors really stepped up to the plate because of how much they believe in the sector and the model and made it happen, and we're glad that they did. It's also, as I mentioned, laid the work or the foundation for the $1.5 billion Canada Rental Protection Fund. I would love it. I'm probably not the only person in BC if they would come up with some slightly more original naming at some point. But what matters is that the model is planned to scale. We've been working closely with them for several months now as they kind of design the policy internally to support the fund, which we've been glad to see them do, realizing they don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've had lots of learnings along the way that we would happily share so that this thing can stand up as quickly and efficiently and effectively as possible so that it can be accessed across the country. That $1.5 billion comprises a combination of just shy of $500 million in capital contributions like ours, as well as $1 billion in debt to go alongside it. Based on our modeling, and it evolves as policy and whatnot changes at the federal level, but there's really potential here that we could see upwards of 25,000 homes move into the community housing sector every 5 years, potentially with the ability for that to be a revolving fund that could see 25,000 homes every 5 years in perpetuity, which would get us a whole lot closer to community housing sector being 7% or even 10% of all housing stock across the country, which I know is the collective goal. With that, I'll maybe turn it over to questions, as I'm sure there may be some, and we've got a little bit of time left to dive into them. So.
I have the mic here,
Okay.
so where's our questions? Okay, we'll go here and then we'll go there.
Hi, thanks for that. The Rental Protection Fund seems to have an arbitrary cutoff. So in this area where we are, I don't know how well you know Vancouver, but there's a category of existing housing stock that's approximately 75 to 100 years old, SROs. And the SROs are, it strikes me, as arbitrarily not capable of applying to this fund. I don't understand why, and if it's not arbitrary, I'd love an explanation as to why it's not arbitrary, and how can we get around that essentially?
Sure. So two pieces, I guess, to that. One, our current investment, the $500 million that we have received from the province, does actually, believe it or not, come with strings attached. We have a contribution agreement with them that is good in terms of how generally broad strokes it is, but does have some kind of baseline requirements in terms of what we can and cannot invest in. Unfortunately, not technically SROs, but self-contained units is one of the restrictions in there. So basically everything in the building must have a full setup, a bathroom, a kitchen, etc. Oftentimes SROs, most of them do not necessarily have that, and so that kind of becomes a restriction on our ability to use those funds to acquire through the fund. As we bring in additional other sources, hopefully over time, whether it's SROs or other housing needs, we may be able to build more flexibility. But right now, our primary funding source is attached to that contribution agreement. One of the other pieces, though, that does factor in there is because of the ability to leverage these assets being such a critical goal, that notion of all of these buildings being able to operate without operating agreements, operating subsidies, et cetera, in place is pretty fundamental. And again, typically a lot of SROs do require some sort of operating subsidy by virtue of the depth of rents that are needed to serve that population, and that can't be sufficient on its own without some operating subsidy. And so while they're not explicitly prohibited, those two pieces tend to eliminate most SROs from being eligible right now.
So if I could just clarify then, it sounds like there's two things, because it still sounds arbitrary, but you're saying it's arbitrary on behalf of the province. So
it's contained within our agreement with the province. It's not arbitrary to SROs because those two requirements would exist no matter what the building is designated. It could be a rental building that requires an operating agreement, for example, that isn't SROs and still would also be ineligible.
I get that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that it needing to be a self-contained suite is an arbitrary decision. It's not based on gravity or the speed of light or anything kind of measurable, right? So is there a way to appeal that? That's one question. The second is when you were talking about the feasibility of a building being able to sustain itself without an operating agreement, is the implication in that statement that the rental protection fund does not apply to people at the lowest spectrum of fixed income, meaning the housing rate in a, say, a disability social assistance check?
In a sense, yes, because this is meant to serve those who have been left behind by the existing programs, a lot of which have been designed to serve those with a deeper need. And what it does do is ultimately free up that operating subsidy rather than subsidizing their rents to support those. But it exists to serve a different segment of the market, although many of the groups acquiring through the fund tend to serve a broad base of different renters, and through their acquisitions with the fund are delivering on their mandate in that way. That's why we co-create the affordability and tenant management strategies with them. Really, the nonprofits bring it forward themselves, and it becomes integrated into their agreements with us because they know their residents, old or new, better than anyone, and so that needs to be developed collaboratively in that way.
I'm just not aware of a program that's aimed at that demographic. I'm not sure what you're referring to. You just said that there was already existing programming or funding for the demographic I just described. I'm not aware of what that is.
A number of the programs through BC Housing or other things like that, deeper subsidy housing programs, not necessarily for funding like ours. They're typically delivered in other ways, but there's a kind of a dearth of funding to support these folks. Do you have a question back there?
Okay, great question, and Mamma mia, that's loud. Thank you, Katie, for the answer. So I'll pass it over to Monica here.
Sorry. Hello. Yes, you can hear me. I was actually going to ask the same question. I work at the City of Vancouver, and my file is around SROs and supportive housing, and we're trying to find ways to protect some of that existing really low-income private stock. So I won't go too much more into it, other than just to also add that they're really beyond the provincial, the provincial acquisition of SROs. There really is no other kind of funding stream to bring that stock into nonprofit hands. And we did just do some engagement with HICC around the Canada Rental Protection Fund, and try to kind of really lobby for SROs to be included in that fund. But it sounds like it's a really similar model, especially around kind of having a revolving sustainable fund, and the price of acquisition and the deeply affordable rents, they just don't work. So this isn't really so much of a question, because you already answered, but if there's any opportunity, like if there's other funding that comes in, or if you have, if you're doing kind of your own engagement with HICC around the program, it would be great just to kind of highlight the need, because if you're talking about being displaced into homelessness, that's really like the bottom lowest end of the housing continuum, and so those people truly have no other options when they're displaced from a private SRO. So yeah, just a little pitch to, there's other opportunities to really make sure that those SROs are included, even though they might, require more of a contribution component and might not contribute to sustainability, but really important to be protected.
Sustainability in a different way, for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's why we want to continually be looking to find additional funding streams, right? Like the reality is that for the past year, we've had one single funding stream, and therefore are constrained, whether SROs or more broadly, to the requirements attached to that, but that funding can layer on top of each other, may be able to collectively supplement those things, and see an impact or a solution in that way. So I guess give us some time, but also continue to advocate including around where additional funding sources may be available that we can help pool together to kind of bridge that gap. But fortunately, we're restricted in it right now. What we are seeing, though, which I didn't expect, but I think has been a really powerful approach for some of those organizations who are serving a large population of folks either living and moving through SROs or just deeper need, is they were really struggling with the fact that they're serving that demographic. They're investing all of this time and money to stand them back up on their feet, and then they get stood up on their feet. They can no longer serve them through those programs anymore, and they feel like they're having to push them off a cliff into the private market to find rent just because they don't fit, those requirements anymore. And we have seen a number of organizations serving that core demographic who have acquired through the fund so that they can provide that next step on the housing ladder to those folks as they've stood their way back up, and are then not falling back into the cycle simply because that leap from where they're at to the top of the market is large for everybody, but especially for those folks who have worked so hard to get to that point. So I do love seeing when those acquisitions happen, because it is a part of serving that segment.
So,
Oh, goodness.
okay. Thanks so much, Katie, and thanks so much for the questions. It's clearly a priority amongst the room, and hopefully we can see the program shifts that we're after. The Downtown Eastside Community Land Trust, your work is life-saving, and I know you'll make it happen in one way or the other, but this is one way we can expedite it and scale it. So we got some more questions in the back of the room. We'll go with Zach, and then we'll go with Elliot.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Hello. I work for a community land trust. We would love to have access to this program. We are in Ontario. And so I was curious, you kind of talked about it a bit, but what does the capital financing stack look like, and how do you guys register that in title? So if we
Great
were
question.
to access this funds, and it was 1.5 million, but that's a mixture of equity,
Yeah.
cash and debt financing. Would one show as a forgivable loan, and the other one shows as debt financing? Does the debt financing come from you? So would it be the rental protection fund on title, or would it be the partner institution with impact investing you have? Just in Toronto, we have the multi-unit residential acquisition fund, MIRA, and the city puts them on our title for the property as a forgivable loan, but they will go second to if we need mortgage debt financing, which is helpful, but it's also annoying because then if I need third financing, this battling with the city, right, which they gave us a grant, but they showed it as a loan to protect affordability. So just curious about how that process works.
Great question. I love this question. I just wasn't sure anyone wanted to get this nerdy with me today. So with each of the acquisitions that come through, it kind of starts with every group having to secure their own financing. That financing is never going to be enough. That mortgage is never going to cover the whole cost, and there's always going to be an equity gap. But our contribution is, oversimplifying a little bit, but sized based on how far that can stretch while being sustainable over a 20-year term, which is the term of our agreement, from an operational perspective. So making sure that as units turn over, it's a realistic turnover rate, and those rents are adjusting in a way that also is supporting their ability to do necessary upgrades adequately, or that they're asking for the right size of renewal grant from us. So in addition to that capital contribution that exists to fill the equity gap left between the purchase price and their mortgage, there's a renewal grant on top of that. And then also we love to see when there is some other source of equity brought to the table, but also, as you saw in kind of the priorities we evaluate it under, it's leveraged by a whole bunch of definitions, the effort to which they've gone to leverage the investment from the fund. So that could be literally bringing equity to the table. In some cases, it could be purchasing a site that's around the corner from something they already operate, so they're getting operational efficiencies that are showing up in their borrowing capacity as well. So it comes from all different definitions of what that leverage looks like. Right now, a lot of the private capital is filling a bridge financing role. So most of our applicants are seeking out MLI Select financing for their long-term takeout financing. But of course, that doesn't come quickly. And so there's a necessary gap to be filled during that period of time, either through bridge financing or vendor take-back mortgages and other things like that. And that's a big gap that the private capital is filling right now. So they're offering below market bridge loans to those groups while they're waiting on their MLI Select financing and their certificate to come through, but also while they're just getting settled in the building. It's a lot. You've taken on, 100 or 200 or 300 new units overnight. You're getting settled, getting to know all those tenants, getting things into place, getting right on top of the renovations, and then on top of that, you're supposed to remember that you've got bridge financing in place and whatnot. So it's also just to give them some breathing room for all of that to continue to play out. Ultimately, that bridge financing will be replaced with MLI Select financing on long-term takeout and proceed from there. So we look at all of that. We ask them to provide and prove out the sustainability of a 20-year cash flow, including detailed capital plans that accompany that, to make sure that everything can be sustainable during that period of time. And then we secure it through a few different agreements, none of which actually are a forgivable loan, but are a bit of a belt and suspenders solution, because we knew that priority on title was going to be a challenge. And for those of our applicants that we often refer to as our inaugural flight crew, who went through the first wave of acquisitions and really provided a lot of feedback and input on those agreements, and bared with us as we convinced CMHC to really change policy at the corporate level. We do have a 219 covenant, which I know is more of a BC-specific term, but there's typically equivalents of it in most provinces, that is registered in priority, and then other agreements that are just kind of, as our council refers to it, belt and suspenders. So that 219 is kind of the belt. It's got two suspenders attached to it. And so not all three of them need to be in priority for them to be effective. There is a contribution agreement that kind of stipulates what's required for us to advance those funds. And then the primary tool we use actually is an option to purchase instead of a forgivable loan. Because we wanted to make sure that if we're making this big equity investment in these acquisitions, that the nonprofits are actually able to leverage them. And if we were just adding more kind of debt to the stack, in a way, that wasn't really accomplishing that goal. But we do need some sort of ability to protect our investment. And so what that option to purchase does is, if they are in default of any of their obligations to us, most of which they've created and then we've registered on title once approved, then we actually have the ability to action that option, temporarily purchase back the property and place it into the hands of a new organization who's just better situated to steward it forward at that point in time. A lot of the lenders really like that too, because they don't have, their mortgage can stay in place as long as they're okay with the new nonprofit, and they have approval on that. Then all of their stuff can kind of stay in place. Excuse me, and it also comes off at the end of those 20 years, or if they find somewhere along the way that redevelopment or densification in some way might be the right path forward for them for whatever reason, it gives that opportunity to ensure that we're the first people they have to come talk to about that. They won't really be able to do much without removing that option to purchase, and we can't predict the future or try to prescribe in an agreement now that might not have effect for 18 years what those relocation requirements or whatever would be. So it just simply puts the trigger in the right place with the ability for us to remove that early if we see fit and they're making a net positive impact on affordability. So that'll all look a little bit different under the federal fund, but that's the rough kind of structure. Although they are looking at the same kind of securitization approach.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. We're gonna go next to Elliot, and then there's a quick question on the Zoom, but we only have about 6 minutes left, so
Okay.
These ones will be two tight ones. Go off, Elliot.
I can't hear him.
Click the button.
Test 1,
Oh.
2.
There you are.
Test. Check. Good. Okay. Well, thank you for that presentation. So I'm both a housing researcher and someone helping to launch a community land trust in New Westminster. So I'm going to ask two questions from that latter hat. The first is whether it's possible for partners to apply as an applicant, or whether it has to be a single organization. And I ask that question because I think about, for us, if we were to apply for something, I would imagine it would have to be with larger partners with a lot of operations experience, management, capital acquisition stuff. And then my second question is about what the range of projects are that are required in terms of size. I imagine that they tend to be larger buildings in terms of maximizing impact, but I'm wondering if there are also smaller projects too that get funded.
Yes. Sorry, what was your first question again?
Whether there can be like
partners,
I'm doing
yes.
a bad thing of asking multiple questions, but whether you can have partners apply.
Yes, there can be, and we spent a lot of time, especially at the beginning, thinking about what combination of partners would be permitted, but felt it was time well spent because it's an important capacity building and like equitable access piece where you may have all sorts of groups who two groups independently, and we've got a couple examples of this, may not individually qualify, but jointly together have a very complementary set of background, skill set, size of portfolio, financial bench strength, et cetera, that can come together and jointly apply. In fact, we have one where we've got one group who acquired by themselves through the fund first and had their own application, but also then ended up jointly applying with a different organization down the line and acquired another building, the two of them together, because that smaller organization was fairly really brand new, arguably. The other organization was actually an Indigenous-led housing provider, and so they are kind of acting as the capacity builder in that case, where they're the one with the kind of stronger balance sheet, deeper experience, but they kind of wanted to acquire this together. And over time, the other organization will have an increasingly larger interest in the equity of the building. So we love seeing those partnerships come forward because it really unlocks a whole bunch of potential for organizations who have all of that potential and just haven't gotten there yet, but can with the help of someone else. And really beautiful matches do happen along the way. On size, we've been really pleased, and it's been a priority, in particular over the last few months while we both await the launch of the federal fund, but also kind of managing our deal flow in the meantime. We have been explicit in wanting to prioritize smaller acquisitions, as well as those in geographies that hadn't yet got a chance to acquire through the fund. I think our smallest building is 11 units by a much smaller nonprofit. Our largest one, actually, on a building basis, might be CLTs, but we also had a group who acquired 9 buildings in 3 communities on the North Island. Port Hardy, Campbell River, and Duncan. That was about 330 units total, just spanned across a bunch of smaller buildings. So it's a really wide range, and that's part of why the acquisition strategy exists in stage 1. And our whole evaluation approach is contextual. We didn't want to set an arbitrary, like, you must operate at least 400 units in order to be eligible. You can operate 40 units as long as you, to still pre-qualify, as long as you are bringing forward a building that maybe isn't 400 units in size, that is maybe growing your portfolio by another 15 or 11 or 20, and making sure that that growth, that size and scale is contextual to the organization, not just to the landscape as a whole, because that's not really fair or equitable. Just the big get bigger if that's the case.
Oh my goodness, wonderful. Thank you so much, Katie, for coming to speak with us today. Thanks for the questions, everybody. We're about at time, so yeah.
Excellent.
Let's hear a round of applause, yeah.